Religion, Myth, and Magic, The Anthropology of Religion, Lecture 3. Mythology.
Mythology is one of the oldest aspects of human culture studied in anthropology. It was readily apparent when anthropologists first went into other cultures that people told stories that explained things. When anthropologists would ask people why something was or how something came to be, people often made reference to myths, often very elaborate myths and stories. This seemed unusual to anthropologists at the time, although it really isn't, and we'll talk more about that. But many of the early anthropologists referred to this as something that they found to be unusual and therefore worthy of study. One of the early anthropologists to study myth was a man named Franz Boas, who was probably more responsible than anyone else for developing American anthropology. He's widely seen to be the father of American anthropology, and he documented hundreds and hundreds of myths, particularly among Native Americans, and particularly among Native Americans of the Northwest Coast. He was struck in particular by their richness, by their variation, and how they reflected particular cultural contexts. He was particularly interested in documenting these and was struck by how suited particular myths were to their cultures. At the other end of the spectrum, another early researcher was a man named Claude Lévi-Strauss. He also studied mythology cross-culturally, but for him, the particularly interesting facet was that there were similar mythic themes. That is, there were similar figures that seemed to crop up again and again in myths if you looked beneath the specific detail. So he felt he could identify, for example, creator figures. One of his more famous was the so-called trickster figure, somebody who seemed to be designed to bedevil humans in various kinds of ways. To him, this meant that mythology was about addressing similar concerns that were widely shared by human cultures in similar kinds of ways. The details were provided by culture, but the basic concerns were things that were shared among all humans. Now, while both of these men took different approaches and in some sense are at kind of opposite ends of a continuum, both of them are essentially right. That is, there are similar themes in many bodies of myth. There are similar concerns that people share widely that are worked out in detail in a vast number of ways. So while there are specific themes that are often the case, nevertheless, the details of them are hooked to specific kinds of cultural concerns. Now, what both men realized, despite their differences in approach, is that myths are not, in that sense, just stories. That is, they're not just things that people tell for fun. Rather, the importance of mythology was to provide an explanation for things that people see as important. Unlike the way the word is used in ordinary speech, when we say getting a cold from sitting in a draft is just a myth, instead, these anthropologists realized that not only was myth about things that were important, but that they do have an important relationship to truth. It's just that it's a more complex understanding of truth. Now, as with defining religion, there are a lot of different ways to define myth, and probably the best way to think about it is what characteristics myth has. Probably the first thing is that myths are narratives. That is, they are stories in terms of their structure. They have characters, they have a plot, they have a beginning and an end, they tell a story. Something happens, there is a beginning series of events, things happen, and then there is an ending. So in that sense, they are, I suppose, just stories in their structure. Myths are different in important ways from just stories because they have a sacred quality. Now, the word sacred is perhaps a little melodramatic, but insofar as it means something that is special, that is different from the everyday, myths deal with things that are sacred, that are important in certain ways. They touch on aspects of culture that religion considers to be important, and indeed, myths are one way in which those questions that I talked about at the beginning are answered. Now, in that sense, therefore, myths are a kind of solution to a problem. They often take place in the distant past. That is, they happen in times well beyond when humans can remember. They don't always. Sometimes they're in the relatively recent past. But very, very commonly, myths and stories like them, such as legends and things like that, happen at a time when people were not even around. They may also happen in a time long before when people lived, but typically they happen at a time which is no longer accessible to living humans. So in that sense, whether it's the remote past or the recent past, myths typically take place in the past. And given the fact that they provide explanations for things, that makes sense. You can't explain how the world is now with reference to something that happened yesterday. It just doesn't make sense. Now, the key thing that makes myths of particular interest to anthropologists is their meaning. In some sense, it may be true that myths are not factually accurate, but in a very real way, the factual accuracy of myths is kind of irrelevant. In any given culture, there may be some people who believe that the myth actually happened in the way that it is told. There may be some people who completely reject the notion that it ever really happened, and there may be any number of intermediate positions in between. The key thing is that myths are understood to be true in terms of their meaning, not necessarily true in terms of the events that they tell. In that way, they are very similar to fiction, in that while we know fiction didn't really happen, nevertheless, we may find enormous truth in it. If you've ever read a book that was a novel or seen a movie, and somehow it spoke to you as being about something important, and therefore in that sense true, then you sort of have an idea about how myth works. Whether or not myths actually happened isn't as important as what they tell us, as the meaning that they have. And so the notion of truth with regard to myths is about their meaning, not about their specific events. Now, the importance of the meaning also is a way of understanding what cultures consider to be significant in terms of their own society. In other words, if we work backwards by looking at myths, we can understand what cultures consider to be important in terms of their own societies. If you consider, for example, the famous story of George Washington and the cherry tree, which in some technical sense probably isn't really a myth, but will serve for present purposes. The story as it's told is that George Washington, for reasons that I've never fully understood, chopped down his father's prized cherry tree. His father was understandably not thrilled and tried to figure out who had done it. And so the story goes, when he was confronted, Washington admitted that in fact he had done it. Now, did this story ever actually happen? I don't know. I don't know that anybody really knows. When George Washington was a child, probably no one was paying attention to him, and so he may well have done it. There's really no way to know. But the story gets told again and again and again, not because we necessarily think it actually happened, but because it tells about things that we consider to be important. It speaks to values that we think are significant. So, we admire Washington because he was honest, because he was brave, because he showed integrity. These are all characteristics that ultimately we want in our leaders, and therefore we tell this story because it illustrates something in a narrative form that we consider to be important. So whether or not it really happened isn't really relevant. The important thing about the myth, if it is a myth in that sense, is that it tells us about meaning, about something that we consider to be crucial. Now, from an anthropological point of view, it's very lucky that all cultures therefore have myths, because by the analysis of myth, we can then reveal ways of seeing the world that we might not otherwise see. Now, I want to give you an example of this by looking at a myth that is told in a book called The Sorrow of the Lonely and the Burning of the Dancers, in which an anthropologist named Edward Shefflin wrote about the Kalali people of Papua New Guinea. The book is actually about other things, and we'll talk about other aspects of this culture later. But almost literally in a footnote, he tells the creation story that the Kalali people tell about where they came from, literally where the Kalali people originated. So the story goes, the Kalali believe that all things had their origin in a time long ago, as you can imagine, which is translated, the term that they use is translated, when the land came into form. Now, at that time, according to the story, as most people tell it, there were no trees or animals or rivers or food or anything. Instead, the earth was entirely covered by people. The people, as you can imagine, began to get hungry and cold because they had nothing to eat, they had nothing to drink, they had nothing to build houses with. One man then steps out of the crowd and he says, "Everyone gather around here." And when everyone assembled, he began to assign people roles. So he told one group of people to go be trees, and they became trees. And he told another group of people to be fish and bananas and rivers and things of that nature, until everything in the world was created. So the story goes then, the few people who were left after all this happened became the human beings of the world and effectively were the ancestors of the modern Kalali people. Now, if we think about this story in the context of other creation stories, we can begin to see certain differences between how the Kalali see themselves and how, for example, we may see ourselves. As a way of comparing, we can look at the creation story as it is broadly understood in the Christian tradition, in the sense that these are stories, whether or not they come from God or from people. The stories in Genesis and so on are also myths. That is, they tell about particular truths in story form. And one of the stories from Genesis, there are actually several versions of creation in Genesis, but the first one specifically tells about how God, who was the person sort of in charge of everything, or the spirit, the deity, specifically created everything in the world. And in fact, he divided it all up into specific days. So some days he created oceans and fish, and some days he created plants and birds and sea creatures and everything else. And that lasted about 5 days, according to the story. And then on the 6th day, God created all sorts of animals and things like that. And then at the end, he created people. And he specified that they were like him, that they were to be the master of all life on the earth. And he then specifically gave them the earth for them to have, to use, to keep themselves. He then blessed the people. He said, multiply the earth, take care of it, it's yours, enjoy. And then on the 7th day, God rests. Now, this is a separate story from the one that talks about Adam and Eve and so on, and we're not going to go into that one because it enters all sorts of other complications into the discussion. But if we consider these two sets of myths, we can see very different kinds of themes in them. In some ways, it's similar. That is, they are both talking about creation in the sense that they are talking about literally where the world came from. They both start with certain conditions. In the Kalali version, there are people, In the Christian version, there is God. And so there is a kind of initial creation that happens out of an existing group in that sense. They're also similar in the sense that the two eventually get to the world as we know it. That is, all things are created, all the major kinds of variety in the world are created, all of the different animals and plants and humans and so on ultimately end up populating the world in the way that we come to understand. So in that sense, we can go back to Levi-Strauss and say there is a kind of continuing theme here of creation, of how the world came to be, that starts from a sort of existing condition and ultimately ends up with a wide variety of things in the world as we know it. However, at the same time, there are clearly significant differences in these two that speak to aspects of these societies which are also very different. For example, on the one hand, the Khalili story starts with humans. That is, people are at the very, very beginning. In that sense, too, people form the kind of basic substance of the world. That is, in a sense, whatever stuff is used to make the rest of the world comes from humans. And so in a very fundamental way, you can argue that for Khalili people, they are all of a piece of the world. They are all the same matter, if you will. It's also the case that in the Khalili version, there is a human being who effectively takes charge. That is, there's an individual person who stands up, who assigns people their particular roles. And so, in that sense, the act of creation is something that humans almost do for themselves. From that point of view, then, it is, in a sense, human initiative. It's also interesting that it's pretty clear that the individual here is intended to be male, which also reflects Khalili society. This is not a society that is strongly hierarchical, but nevertheless, there is a kind of notion in Khalili society that males provide the kind of basic blueprint for humans. And so the idea that a man in particular would be in the position to create the world makes a certain cultural sense. Now, at the same time, there is also a notion here that while Khalili understand the world to be of the same stuff, nevertheless, it is clear that the world is created for the Khalili to use. That is, the reason the world came into being is because the Khalili needed it to. That is, they needed food, they needed shelter, they needed warmth, and things like that. So, in that respect, the Khalili people are given the world in a sense, or I suppose since it was a person that did the creation, they take the world, and therefore the world is theirs to use. Now, if we look at the Christian story, on the other hand, there are very distinct differences. For one thing, there is nothing equivalent to a notion of God in the creation story for the Khalili. That is, a being who precedes all life, who is in a fundamental way separate from all life, and therefore is in some way entirely other from the natural world. This is one reason, by the way, that I always talk about the supernatural as a kind of problematic concept, and we'll talk more about this later on. But the Khalili are a good example of a people who don't really have deities in that sense. There is no God in that respect, at least not in traditional Khalili religion. Since that time, they have become increasingly Christianized and things have changed in certain ways. But there is no figure that is analogous to the God of the Christian story. It's also clear, too, that God creates the world largely for his own purposes, in the sense that there is no particular reason given, unlike the Khalili story, where the world is specifically created for people to use because people needed it. Instead, in the Christian story, it simply happens. There is no specific reason. And arguably, this makes sense in terms of notions of God's will. That is, God does things because God wants to. And therefore, there's no specific reason why God created the world. It was simply something that happened. It's also the case here that humans are at the end of the process. Unlike the Kalali story, where humans are the existing condition, that is, they are the first condition. In the Christian version, humans don't come until the end. That is, they are, in a sense, the culmination of the creation that God has engaged in, and therefore they are a very different sort of being. Again, this also makes a certain amount of sense in terms of how the creation is understood, because while in both myths the world is created in some sense for humans to use, in the Christian version it is done because God specifically gives the world to people in order for them to use. Whereas in the Kalali version, there is some understanding that people are creating the world because they need it. This makes sense in terms of the differences between the two societies. For Kalali people, there is a much more egalitarian society. Things are much more equal. And there is a sense that people gain status because of the way that they behave. In other words, people who want to accomplish things in society do so at their own request. People stand up, take action, etc. And this is very much reflected in the myth as it is told. As in Kalali society, when someone wants to go hunting or plant a garden, and if they want help, they get up and they do it, and people will then get up to help them or not. In the creation story, that's exactly what happens here. That is, a man gets up because he takes the initiative, deciding that people are going to need food and shelter. So society in general here is clearly reflected in the myth. In the Christian story, by contrast, humans are effectively the end point of God's creation, and therefore, while they are in a sense part of the natural world, it's also clear that humans are understood to have a special place in the world. That is, God has created a bunch of other things ahead of time, and then he comes around to creating human beings. In that sense, it makes sense in terms of the larger society. That is, in traditional Christian theology, humans are understood to have a special place as being, in particular, like God. In the Kalali version, people are understood to all, in effect, be the same material as the rest of the natural world. In the Christian version, God is understood to set humans apart specifically. It's also probably significant, although I know that there are other ways of interpreting it, that God is gendered male in this story. That is, while God on the one hand is understood to be a neutral figure in terms of gender, that is, God is understood to encompass both male and female, it is probably significant here that typically the word he is used when talking about God. We could argue about the relative position of men and women in Christian societies, but that would be a whole different course. But nevertheless, it's worth observing that clearly in traditional Christian society, there is an understanding that men have a different place, usually a superior place, to women. And that is probably also reflected in this myth. So, by comparing these two myths, these two stories, it is possible to see different kinds of themes in these two versions of creation. And by analyzing them, we can tie them back then to the culture of which they are a part. And you can see how these stories not only explicitly tell about how the world was created in terms of events, but also reflect larger kinds of cultural themes in terms of the importance of individual action in the Kalali version, the importance of humans in the Christian version, and so on. So not only do myths in the literal sense explain how things happen, myths also reflect in a more general sense the important ideas that societies hold in terms of their organization. Now, we can also throw in, just for fun, a scientific notion of where the world came from. Since I said at the beginning that science is a worldview that functions in many ways similarly to religion, we can look at a scientific version of the world. If we think about evolution in that respect, this is an entirely different kind of creation story, if you will. That is, it talks about evolution happening without any overarching guidance, but rather as a natural process. It talks about gradual change over time, that this change happens in response to changes in the natural environment. It also talks about humans being, in a sense, the end point of a process of evolution. That is, if we look at evolution from a chronological point of view, we start out with simpler forms and we end up with more complex forms. And one of the most complex forms is human beings. In that respect, then, there are sort of interesting parallels between creation from a scientific point of view and the Christian version, both of which, in a sense, culminate in human beings appearing. However, there is clearly a significant difference here in terms of the human position in the natural world. While humans may be the end process of evolution in some sense, nevertheless, humans are still fundamentally a part of the natural world, and there is no necessary reason why the natural world should be something that humans use or particularly fashion for their own ends. So in that sense, the scientific version is very different from the scholarly and the Christian versions, where the world is specifically created for human ends. In the scientific version of the creation of the world, if you will, humans are simply part of a process. That process is something that is not directed, unless you consider just adapting to the environment to be a particular direction. It is an autonomous process. That is, it happens without any kind of guidance from any kind of overarching figure, something analogous to God in the Christian version or the man who stands up in the scholarly version. And therefore, it is a process which happens for far different reasons. It is, in a sense, almost a random process. It's not a guided process. Now, I'm not suggesting that in a literal sense we can think of the scientific version of creation as a myth, although there is a sense in which it is understood in an analogous way in our society. That is, the way most people understand evolution to happen is very much mythic. That is, most people probably don't bother to think about the science or read the original papers or anything like that. But rather, there is a kind of story that is told that kids learn in school and so on. And so while I suppose you could argue that the scientific version has a different sort of underpinning from, indeed, the Christian version or the scholarly version, it is still nevertheless experienced by most people as a myth, and therefore speaks to a very different kind of cultural setting than the traditional Christian version or indeed the traditional scholarly version. Now, because myth is intimately connected to the cultures that generate it, it is also the case that myths change over time. This is probably part of the reason why there is more than one story of creation in the Bible, and the one that talks specifically about Adam and Eve, the creation of Eve using Adam's rib, and so on, actually comes after the more general version that I was analyzing a minute ago. Myths change because culture changes. As society changes through time, there are different concerns, different issues, different things that people find important, and therefore myths have to change in order to reflect that. The myths that were told in probably European society 200 or 300 years ago are almost certainly different than the stories that we tell now, because we live in a different society now. In some cases, we can actually see this in myth, in that anthropologists have been in the position to hear about myths and study the same societies over enough time that they can see the changes in the stories. A good example of this is the Kalali myth I just told you, which is itself the traditional version. That is, in the traditional version, a man stands up. He's nothing in particular. He's not a particular person. He's not particularly interesting. He's just some guy. Interestingly, as Christianity has moved into this area and more people became Christians starting in the 1970s, this man has been increasingly identified as Jesus. And so, as the story is often told now, the man that stands up actually is Jesus of the Christian tradition. And so Jesus, in effect, creates the Kalali world in this kind of framework, reflecting the fact that there are different issues in terms of religion now in Kalali society than there were in traditional Kalali society. So what we learn by analyzing myths is, on the one hand, that there are certain similarities in them across human cultures, that there are certain themes that all cultures share. Creation, where the world came from, these are very common interests. On the other hand, the details of those particular stories reflect specific cultural concerns and specific cultural themes. Therefore, by analyzing these, we can use myths as a way to get at what society considers to be important. Therefore, while myths may or may not be true in some sense, and that's how we use the word commonly, nevertheless, myths speak to truth. They tell things that are true, things that have meaning in society, and that's why they're told and retold. That's also why myths have to change over time. Those truths change over time as well, and so myths have to change in order to reflect what people consider to be important. So contrary to the use of the word myth as being something that isn't true, myths, in fact, are fundamentally true. They are stories that talk about fundamental truths in a given society and therefore speak to the importance of those truths. Now, one of the things that is often used in myth is symbol. And the importance of symbol in mythology and in other aspects of religion is something that anthropologists have studied for a very long time. And so we will turn next to the anthropological understanding of symbols and how symbols are used particularly in religious contexts.
This ends Lecture 3.